Hi, this is Imre Galambos, Professor of Chinese at the University of Cambridge. This video addresses the question of how old Chinese characters are. This is a question that comes up from time to time, both in class by students studying Chinese and also by outsiders who are simply interested in this. Some people imagine that Chinese characters are much older than they really are. Others don't even know what to think. So if you're interested in this, stick around. Okay, so how old are Chinese characters? Chinese characters go back a long way. They go back to the beginnings of Chinese civilization, and they are here with us in our modern world. They are the fiber that holds together this cultural and political conglomerate that we conveniently label China. This, of course, implies that we're talking about the same culture from beginning to the end, which, of course, is not really the case because the concept of China is much newer. So when I'm talking about Chinese characters in the remote past, technically I'm not being entirely accurate, and what I really mean is the ancestors of the graphs used in China and other countries of East Asia. But for the sake of convenience, I will be still referring to them as Chinese characters. At any rate, it is certainly true that the Chinese characters we use today are the descendants of the ones used in their early history. There's an uninterrupted chain of development that stretches through centuries and even millennia, and sometimes even linguistic and political boundaries. The earliest known examples of Chinese characters are the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang period, and they date to about 1300 before the Common Era. These are divination records carved or rather scratched into bone, and the bones are typically turtle plastrons or less commonly bovine scapula. The inscriptions were discovered about 120 years ago, and relatively quickly it became apparent that they represented an earlier stage of the Chinese script. And this, of course, made it possible to decipher them. Still, it took decades to decipher the inscriptions, and this work continues even today. In fact, today there are about 3,000 characters that remain undeciphered. It is often claimed that the script used in the oracle bone inscriptions was a fully functional writing system, which was already at a mature stage. Which also means, according to some scholars, that the characters don't represent the earliest stage of the development of the script, but by this time had been around for at least for a couple of hundred years or more. Unfortunately, we do not really have evidence of this, so this remains a conjecture deduced primarily from the internal structure of characters. There are, however, much earlier signs carved on pottery, but these go back to the Neolithic period, predating the oracle bone inscriptions by thousands of years, and may not actually be true writing, as there's only a very limited number of signs and we have no idea what they mean. And because of this, we cannot establish a direct link between the Neolithic signs and the oracle bone inscriptions. The Jiahu signs, for example, are thought to date to around 6,600 to 6,200 years before Common Era, which would make them around 5,000 years earlier than the oracle bone inscriptions. To me, this gap in time is simply insurmountable. Even if some signs look similar to the characters in the oracle bone inscriptions, I find it totally inconceivable that there would be a direct genetic connection between them. And of course, the Jiahu signs, as all Neolithic signs, are completely incomprehensible. We don't even know whether they are just symbols or they functioned as true writing, that is, the signs represented individual words. By contrast, the graphs of the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang period can be positively connected with the characters of the Chinese script of later periods. We can read the oracle bone inscriptions, and many of the graphs have similar meanings as later, which of course was a great asset in the course of deciphering them. There's also a historical connection, and so there's clearly a link between the content of the inscriptions and our knowledge of history. So there you have it. The earliest extant examples of Chinese writing date from around 1300 BCE, which makes Chinese writing at least 3,300 years old. It may be older, after all, most things derive from earlier things, but there's no concrete evidence to that effect. So the only thing we can be certain of is that an early version of the Chinese script was already in use 3,300 years ago. Moreover, this was in a region that later became Central China. Claims that Chinese characters go back 5,000 years are simply not true. And within the global landscape of ancient writing systems, Chinese characters are actually not that old. This is especially true if we compare them to the writing systems in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the earliest examples of which date to around 3200–3400 before Common Era. And this makes them 2000 years older than the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang period. There are in fact several other scripts that are older or just as old as the Chinese. But what makes Chinese characters unique is that they had such a long stretch of uninterrupted history, leading all the way to our modern world. Considering China's economic development, it is very likely that the Chinese language will be among the main languages people around the world will be learning. And so that also means that Chinese characters will be learned and used by even more people, and not just the ones born and raised in China. Okay, that's all I have to say for now about how old Chinese characters are. Let me know if you have any questions or if there is a topic you want me to talk about. And please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. That helps the channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time.